Some backstory. I'm a female in my early 20s, and I moved to Belfast from Sweden a few years ago. The taxi prices here are so much better than the ones where I'm from, and for a good year and a half I relied on taxis getting me pretty much everywhere, including to and from work. I usually tell this story to friends and family as a funny story, whenever I have a few drinks in me, or someone brings it up, but to be honest with you, I was completely horrified when it happened. So, about a year and a half ago, I was out for drinks with a friend of mine, and her friend that was visiting from abroad, and was staying at my house since I had a spare room. For some reason, they went home before me, and I was left by myself at the bar, which I know is a really dumb thing to do. After an hour or so, a few drinks, and a failed attempt at picking someone up, I decided it was time to call it a night. I usually book taxis as there are a few handy apps, but with it being a pay weekend, there was no way I'd be able to get a car, so I walk outside, hoping for the best. The moment I get outside, I'm approached by an older man, white hair and on the heavier side, asking if I need a taxi, so I cheerfully accept, thanking my lucky stars that I'll be home very soon. The taxi I was in didn't belong to a taxi company, which admittedly is a bit strange, but I've taken those before with friends without issue. Right off the bat, the driver starts asking the usual questions, like where I'm from and how long I've been in town, if I'm studying or if I'm working, what brings me here, and so on. Then he asks if I've ever been on a black taxi tour. These tours are quite famous here, and they're meant to be really good, showing off all the murals in the city and the Peace Wall and such. You also get stories from people that grew up here during the Troubles. I say that no, I haven't had the opportunity yet, but I'll definitely get to it as soon as I can. He then suggests when we get to my house that he'll give me a tour. As I mentioned before, I'm not in a black taxi. He then tells me he'll do it for free, right now, in the middle of the night. Being the way too nice idiot I am, I hear myself saying, "Yeah, sure, that would be nice," when what I really meant was, "Hell nah, dude." So he starts driving out of town, down countryside roads and not at all in the direction of any murals, and on the other side of town from the Peace Wall. His questions get more personal, asking if I have a boyfriend and if I have family around, if I live by myself and if I have many friends. He then says, "We can be friends. You'd like that, wouldn't you?" He has this creepy laugh going, while repeating the phrase over and over and nudging my side with his arm. He keeps driving in the middle of nowhere, talking about how this footpath was this and that, connecting to another footpath and so on, while dropping the "we can be friends" thing in between. At this point, we're about 20 minutes outside of town, and the streetlights stop. It's pitch black. I'm clutching my phone, ready to call the police, and looking at the dashboard GPS to see nearby location names, and getting ready to tuck and roll out of the car, completely freaked out by him. I'm finally able to stutter out that I'm getting a bit tired, and it's time for bed. He agrees to take me home, and turns around. We pull up outside my house again, and I feel a wave of relief washing over me, like I can finally breathe again. I pay him for the taxi ride, and get ready to get out of the car. He then turns the car off, takes off his seatbelt, and keeps talking, turning slightly so he's kinda half facing me. After a few minutes of talking, him still talking about being friends, I say that I need to use the bathroom and thank him for the tour. He tells me to hurry back outside so we can continue the conversation. I bolt inside, lock the door and keep the hall light turned off. I look out through the peephole and I can see that he's still sitting there in his car. After about 15 minutes, he finally drives away, and I sort of just collapse on the floor, beating myself up for being so stupid. Needless to say, I've never taken a taxi. I haven't booked since.
I just found this sub, and I wanted to share my own experience. It happened when I was 13, and it's something I've never forgotten. We had just moved into a brand new house in a brand new housing development. A lot of the houses around us were either unfinished or had families that had just moved in. And behind our house was a lot of field mostly for future homes. We lived in a fairly safe small city, and the housing development was very quiet so far. And at least for the first few years that we lived there, we never bothered to lock the doors. Even at night most of the time, it just wasn't something we thought about. My parents had just put in hardwood floor, so the house was a pretty echoey single story. One night I was laying in bed, trying to fall asleep. I thought I heard the back sliding glass door open. I was up late on the internet, but everyone else was asleep in the house, so it was pretty quiet. I had my door slightly open, so my cat could come and go, and so I knew that I was definitely hearing something. I froze, hoping it wasn't the door, but a moment later I heard it slide shut. Then I began to hear what sounded like heavy shoes walking across the hardwood floor. It was a very specific sound, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. The footsteps were slow and quiet, like they were trying to make as little noise as possible, but because the floor was wood and our house had high ceilings, the steps echoed down the hallway and into my room. Then I heard them stop, the sound of the hallway closet being opened, and then the door quietly clicking shut. They turned the knob and pulled the closet door, and then released the knob once it was in place. It was silent after that. My heart was beating so fast, I began to cry. The only way to my parents' room was up the hallway, and their door was about only 20 feet away from where that hallway closet was. I was frozen, and I honestly thought I'd pee my pants. I was so scared. However, it was silent for long enough that I knew I had to get my dad. So I stood up and walked sock-footed to my door. I stood there for a long time, just breathing. Then I ran. It's not a long hallway, but I went as fast as I could. I got inside the room and tried to wake up my dad. "Dad! Dad!" I was frantically whispering. "Huh?" He was half asleep. "Dad!" "Huh? What?" "Dad, I think there's someone inside the house." "What?" "Get up! I think there's someone inside the house." "There's no one in here. Go back to sleep." "Yes, there is." And I started crying. That gets him up. My mom also wakes up at this point as well, so they both got out of bed. My dad, sure that there's no one in the house, doesn't even grab something as a weapon. But I follow behind him as he leaves the room. He goes into the living room, passes the closet, and turns on all the lights in the house. I remember standing in the living room, knowing exactly where the person was and not being able to say anything. He tells me, "Look, there's no one here." He doesn't even check the closet though, and I don't know what to tell him. I'm so afraid that whoever is in here will jump out with a knife and kill my dad in front of me. The 13-year-old me keeps thinking that I can't be the one possible for my dad's death. So I say nothing, and I don't tell him to check the closet. I don't know why he didn't, because if I were a dad, I would have. He locks the front door and tells me to go back to bed. They wait until I'm back in my room before they close their own bedroom door and go back to sleep. Again, the house is silent, and I'm laying there afraid because that person is still here in the one place that he didn't look. Suddenly I hear the closet door open, just as slowly and as quietly as before. Then the footsteps again. I could hear them so clearly, walking towards the kitchen where the back door was, and then they stop. It's followed by the sound of the back door being slid open again, and then quietly being pushed closed. I hear the back door click into place, and then the house is silent. I'm laying there crying and breathing, but hearing them leave the house, I felt instant relief, though I was still shaking with fear. I give it a few minutes, hoping they wouldn't come back, and they don't. So after a bit, I sneak out there. My one and only thought is to lock the back door, which I managed to do, but the scariest part was that when I looked in the hall closet, the door wasn't closed anymore. It was cracked because they hadn't bothered to close it, even after they left. Though I know it was definitely closed when my dad was out there with me. I tried bringing it up to them years later, and they still didn't believe me. But that's not just something you hear.
This story took place when I was 20 years old and living in New Hampshire at my parents' house. I had been back home for a little over a month now, after a defunct experience at a college in Boston that wasn't the right fit for me. In the meantime, I was taking classes at a local community college. Anyway, going from living in Boston for a semester and having total independence, as well as almost endless opportunities for fun with other cute gay guys like myself, to back with my parents in rural New Hampshire was a huge knockback, and I was seeking thrills in the meantime to numb the pain. Sometimes, I have an almost ravenous sexual appetite, which was hard to satisfy in New Hampshire. I used gay hookup websites such as Manhunt and the app Grindr to meet other like-minded guys in my area. Not surprisingly, these sites and services come with their fair share of creepers, but I honestly never found myself threatened when they reached out, just sort of flattered and then would take comfort in the fact that I could easily block them. The problem occurred when some guys couldn't take a hint though, and there was one in particular that kept attempting to contact me under different usernames after I would block him. His original username was something along the lines of SoccerBoy123. His profile picture on Manhunt was of a fit-looking guy from the neck down. He reached out to me and we began chatting. He said he lived in Concord, which is roughly an hour south of where I lived, and also where my community college was located at the time. We were chatting about explicit stuff, use your imagination, and possibly meeting up, when I asked to see some pictures of him, including one of his face. He sent the pictures over. I could notice that they didn't really seem to match up with each other, not to mention his profile picture. The face picture I requested was also missing. I replied with something like, hot, and I asked him again for a picture of his face. He gave me the old, this computer is new and I don't have one on here yet line. And I said I wasn't going to continue chatting unless I saw one. He eventually caved, and he sent me a few photos of his face. I'm not shallow, but he was ugly. I wondered why he didn't continue his trend of sending fake hot pictures. The thing about him I found most unattractive was a huge mouth full of really crooked, very messed up teeth that kind of protruded out in a freakish sort of way, even with his mouth closed. I think I blocked him right away, being kind of weirded out by the whole thing, and I went along with my business. However, in the months that followed, I began receiving hostile-sounding messages from phony-looking profiles on both Manhunt and Grindr. Most of them were blank and contained little to no information about the user. The messages were tinged with a strange, bitter tone, and the sender acted like he knew me. He'd say things like, "You're a shallow little prick," "You're fucking ugly inside," and "Someone's gonna teach you a lesson someday." They actually really started to creep me out after I repeatedly blocked the person, and they would come back with another blank profile and continue to message me. I had a feeling who it was. One night, sometime around early March I believe, it was getting late, and I was feeling kind of horny, so I turned on Grindr and I started browsing. I messaged this one guy without a picture, but some stats like a football player. My philosophy is that I can always ask for a face picture after I say hello, because some guys are very closeted. We began chatting. We exchanged pictures, and he seems not only legitimate, but hot. We discussed meeting up, and he says he lives in Concord. Well, it's getting really late. Concord is an hour away, and it's fucking freezing out. It's still very cold during March in New Hampshire. I was not thinking with the head on my shoulders though. So I got dressed, pulled on my parka, and hopped in my car to make the hour-long drive. We continued to chat using Grindr on my way down, but as I neared the city and began asking exactly where to go, the conversation took a weird turn. He gave me an address, but said that he wanted me to wait outside because his parents were asleep, and that he was going to sneak downstairs to unlock the door. Then, he would go back in his room and text me when it's unlocked so that I could walk in and up to his room on the right. This was the strangest set of instructions I had ever received. But what was even more strange was that he didn't want me to turn on a single light as I walked into his house, up the stairs, and then into his room for fear of waking up his parents. At this point, I've already parked the car on the populated yet entirely dead street, and I began counting the ascending numbers to the house. I find myself in front of a large, blue Victorian house that needs a little taking care of, with no light coming from any of the windows. Now I am creeped out. I message him and let him know that I'm outside, and I wait for some sort of light to come on. He tells me to wait, because his dad just got up to get a drink or something, but no lights come on in the house. I am getting seriously creeped out and impatient while waiting, and decide to tell him I'm leaving. I start walking, and all of a sudden, he reveals to me that he gave me the wrong address, and that I should be at X number on X street instead. I'm feeling beyond weirded out, and actually kind of pissed off. I was just standing outside of this random house for 10 minutes in the cold and dark night, only to find out he deliberately gave me the wrong address. I honestly want to go home now, but my other head is really banking on the possibility of this being good, and I just drove a fucking hour, so I pull out my iPhone and mapped it out. It didn't take me long to realize the new address was in my line of vision and sat across the street at a small intersection that led to more houses. I moved towards the house. This one, a large white colonial house with green shutters and an orange street lamp that shined down upon it. I let him know that I'm outside, although no lights are showing through the windows. This time, he says the door is unlocked. He wants me to come upstairs in the dark and enter his room. Then, feel for a mattress and get down on it. He says he wants me to just feel what's happening instead of seeing it, and assures me it will be so hot. Fuck no, I think, beginning to give in to the impending fear taking hold of me. But in a last-ditch effort from my other head, I give him an ultimatum. Either come down here, open the door, and let me in with the lights on, or I'm leaving. He says he'll comply, and I wait, now excited for this hot, straight football player to come and open the door. I stare with a shaky, adrenaline-fueled gaze at the door for what seems like forever when I sense movement. Yes, he's actually coming down. The door pushes slowly outward, and that's when I saw, emerging from the darkness, his face, his teeth, washed in the orange light from the street lamp. This was not who I thought I was meeting. An icy, stabbing chill washed over me as we made eye contact, and he gestured for me to come inside. I knew who this was. This was the man who has been contacting me. I looked at him and yelled, "No! Fuck no!" And I started half running, half walking away from the house, and back to my car. I looked back after a few seconds, and he was watching me from the door. I got to my car, and quickly got in, locked the doors, and sped home.
I've been a long-time lurker of Let's Not Meet, and I have a story of my own that still haunts me to this day. Let me set the scene for you. I was 7, currently 25, and my mother was dating a man with a daughter who was about 15. Her name was Christy. While she did not live with us, she did stay with us on some weekends. The reason this is important will come into play a little later. I grew up in a moderately isolated area in the south. My mother's house is on about 90 acres, most of it being heavily wooded. For the most part, it was quiet. The type of place where people didn't lock their doors and everyone knows each other. It was quiet until one sequence of events that shook my community to its core. There was a man just 2 streets over from mine who murdered his girlfriend's entire family, including her, in their home over a dinner about 2 weeks before this event took place. It was also learned later that he had also murdered his mother and father in their home, as they were found after his girlfriend's family was. He hadn't been caught, and the local police were working with the police in Tennessee as there had been reportings of people citing him there. My mother had gotten a security system installed, just to ensure that our home was properly secured. We had alarms on every window and door in our house. On this Saturday, my mother got called into work, as she was an apartment manager and there was an emergency that she needed to tend to. Her boyfriend had gone to work early that morning. My mother was very, very nervous about leaving, and due to the nature of the emergency, she thought it would be best for Christy and I to stay at home where we were safe. Safe. So she thought. She reluctantly left and let us know that her cell phone was always going to be on her if we needed her. Christy and I promptly set the alarm and made sure all the doors were locked. My mother had been gone for about an hour, and we were deep into a movie on Disney and pizza. Suddenly, the alarm started blaring. Christy and I jumped up to see what was going on. On our way to the alarm, you have to pass a very large sliding glass door. What we saw there left us frozen. There was a man prying our door open with a crowbar. He saw us, made eye contact, and quickly ran off into the woods behind my mother's house. I will never forget what he looked like, or the sinister look he had in his eyes. We called the police, and then we called my mother, who had already been alerted by the alarm company. My mother actually arrived before the police did, due to how isolated we really were. When we described the man to the police, they immediately knew it was the man they were looking for. Of course, there was a massive investigation that day of the property and the woods surrounding us. In the woods, they found cigarette butts, lots of canned foods, soda bottles, and a makeshift tent made out of a tarp. The man had been living behind us the entire time, and even stealing food out of our trash. When he was arrested, which was a few hours after the incident, he had admitted to watching our family and learning our habits, knowing that he could take advantage of the house when no one was there. Even now, as an adult, this event follows me. Just goes to show, you really never know who is watching you.
It all started on St. Patrick's Day, in a small town when I met a lanky guy that seemed like fun company. The sun was setting and he said he had some fireworks he could show off. And, having never seen fireworks up close, I agreed. Me, him, and a mutual friend walked to his house, and the fireworks were disappointing, but at least not dangerous. On the way back to town, he started flirting. Now, he was tall. Very tall, compared to me. I'd say definitely over 6 foot, and I'm about 5'3". I thought he was kinda cute, so I flirted back. He decided to say, "I almost want to make a move, but I don't want to scare you." I said go ahead, and he grabbed me. He licked my neck and grabbed my crotch through my jeans. I was shocked. No one had seen this happen except for the 3 of us in a dark alley around 8 p.m. Somehow I forgave him. I thought he was just, I don't know, bad at these things. That maybe he was drunk or tired or something. I remained friends with him. He was one of the only friends I had. It was now summer. I was bored, and I went to his house alone, without telling my parents. They would just be worried for no reason. It looked dusty and old, like peeling paint, and a blanket of dust in some rooms. And something didn't feel right at all. I heard a dog, and it sounded big. It was in the yard. I went into his bedroom, and he closed the door, and there were holes in it. All over it. Holes and slices. When he's mad, he stabs the door, he told me. I was between him and the door. I remember looking past him, and seeing a fish tank before hearing something and flinching. He had thrown a knife into the door. It was impaled into the wood next to me, and now he was laughing because I flinched. "I knew that would scare you," was what he said. I looked back at the fish tank. It was loud. He opened the door. He told me something that still haunts me. He looked me right in the eyes. So close, and at least a foot taller. Oddly, I remember his nose more than his eyes, with how close it was. In a tone somewhere between small talk and the kind of sound like you were complimenting someone's looks. "I could kill you so easily right now." struggling to keep the fear out of my voice after I forced a laugh. I said I'd rather sit outside together, rather than inside with all the dust. I told him I was going to go get some ice cream because he was not allowed to leave his house after his last suicide threat. I tried to keep steady as I walked in the general direction of the carvel. I made sure I was out of his sight. I called my mom and asked to be picked up. Told her I wanted to be picked up because I was bored. She said she could get me within an hour. I decided to spend that hour on the other side of town, in the library. She said something like I look sick. I told her it was just the heat, and she believed me.
I started working at my current summer/part-time job last spring. I'm situated in a large old building that used to be a country club, but it fell into disrepair about 10 years ago. Although there's nothing paranormal about my story, it's just maybe worth mentioning that the former manager committed suicide in the main office upstairs when they went out of business. It adds to the unsettling quality of this place. Along with that, so do the seemingly never-ending hallways and passages, innumerable hidey holes and half-empty pools, and other strange, unused parts of the building, like a secret shower room, sauna, and a tunnel of storage areas that connect the men's and women's bathrooms. There are also a lot of doors to the outside of this place. But currently, we only use one small room for the golf course check-in, the kitchen, and one dining room for the restaurant upstairs. And then one small cafe for early morning golfers to get their tea and beer. The cafe area is where I work. In the summer, we clock in to open the cafe before 6 a.m. This is often before the sun comes up. The golf course people come in pretty shortly after, but I would be the first person in the building every morning. I would unlock the front door, disarm the alarm, walk downstairs in the dark, unlock this cage that's there to keep the drunks from the bar upstairs from coming down and wandering. I'd then crawl along the long, dark hallway with no windows just to get to the light switch at the end of the hall. This always creeps me out, and I end up holding my keys between my fingers like brass knuckles. Mind you, I'm a woman in my mid-20s, and I lived in plenty of bad neighborhoods. I'd ninja slide down the walls on the opposite side of whatever doorway is coming, just because it's pitch black, and I'm a scaredy bear. By the time I get to the end of the hall and flip on the light, my heart is always pounding out of my chest as I struggle to find the right key to let me into the cafe. The whole situation started when Tim, a golf course employee, mentioned that he kept shutting the door between the men's locker room and the storage area that leads to the women's, and every time he would go back in there, it would be open again. This, along with some strange noises, was fodder for the bar regulars upstairs to claim this place was haunted by the old manager and whomever else they say died within these halls. Travis, a co-worker in the cafe, also mentioned that a few minutes after he opened, he went into the men's locker room and noticed that it was steamy and smelled like soap. So he went into the shower room to investigate, and everything was soaking wet and still hot. He was the only person who was supposed to be there at that time of day, but didn't see anyone, so he just let it go. A couple months later, Tim noticed this weird side door that you had to climb up a rickety old staircase on the side of the building. He saw that it wasn't shutting correctly, so he fixed it and locked it. He just didn't think anything more of it. Shortly after, someone from the golf course came over to tell me that they had found someone's entire life packed away into one of their hundreds of lockers that no one used. They thought that someone was living in the storage room between the men's and the women's bathrooms. He must have been coming in before the golf course people set the alarms when they left in the evenings, and leaving after the cafe person would come in and turn off the alarm in the morning. So that means every morning, as I was blindingly shuffled my way down that long, dark hallway alone, one of those pitch-black doorways actually did have someone hiding behind it. A few days later, a red-faced, angry, bald man in Vietnam-era Army-issued glasses came into the cafe and started screaming, puffing and flailing his arms around, yelling about his stuff getting thrown out. He went over to berate one of the golf course people, so they asked him about the contents of the locker. His answers about specific items led them to realize that this is the man who was secretly living in one of the buildings in the many dark hallways. I never found out much about him, but watching him scream about his stuff made it clear that he wasn't 100% rational. I still work there and do a darkness shuffle down the hall every morning when I work. And although they say everything is on the up and up with the alarms and the doors locking, it still creeps me the hell out. There have been some other creepy things that have happened in this place recently to make me think that this isn't all over with, which I'll post separately if anyone's interested.
This happened about a year ago. I'm a 30-year-old white male, and this is in the Deep South. I had relocated to Georgia from Texas about 6 months prior to take a higher paying position within my company. I had managed to make a few good friends in the short time I'd lived there. It was the first Friday of the month in November, which was a pretty big deal in this city. All the bars downtown had drink specials, live music, and events scheduled for First Friday. Downtown was relatively crowded considering how cold it was out. I met a couple of friends at a local punk bar and we started drinking. One of my friends, Adam, was going through a separation and inevitable divorce and was pretty upset about it. After a few hours of heavy drinking, I decided to part ways with my friends and head a few blocks down the main street to a different bar. It was a little after midnight and there were still quite a few people roaming the streets. As I was entering the next bar, I ran into Adam's wife, Becca. She was out with a couple of girlfriends and she told me she was heading to the bar I had just left. As soon as she left, I immediately called Adam to give him a heads up. I had a few more drinks and talked to some people I knew casually. Before long, the lights came on and I closed my tab and started preparing for the walk back. I decided to call my friends and try to get a ride, as I felt like I was just a little too drunk to drive home safely. They told me to meet them in front of the first bar and they would drive me home. On First Fridays in this city, you could take your drinks out of the bar and onto the street as long as you pour them into a solo cup. Most of the bars had a stack at the door before you exited. I poured the rest of my beer into a cup and headed out the door. I was about halfway back to the first bar when I ran into Becca again. She was very drunk and had obviously been crying. She started asking me questions about Adam. Did he say anything about me? Do you think he still loves me? Etc. I tried to calm her down without getting too involved when a man walked out of the shadows and stood about a foot from us like he was part of the conversation. This guy was obviously drunk. He was holding a blue Solo cup, so I figured he must have just left the bar too. He was tall, about 6'2", and relatively clean cut. His eyes were a little crazy, to the point that I believed he may have been on some other drugs as well. We tried to ignore him, and for about a minute, he says nothing. Finally, he asked what I was drinking. I was still holding the Solo cup I got when I left the bar. I told him I was drinking beer. He raised his cup, and we drank. I shrugged him off as just being an annoying drunk. But then he started getting into our conversation. "Is this your boyfriend?" he asked Becca. "Yes," I said, sensing that she was feeling uneasy. He had been inching closer to her. Adam's wife was very attractive and dressed for a night out. Although annoying, I didn't think it was particularly odd that some drunk asshole was trying to talk to her. We again tried to carry on our conversation, hoping this guy would get the hint and leave when out of the blue, he said, "You can do better." That was about all I could take. I said, "Fuck you," and started taking my jacket off. I was pissed. This guy takes off running down the street and I follow. Becca is trailing behind me, telling me to stop, and it's not worth it. She was right. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, a taxi cab pulled up to the curb, right in front of this guy, and he hops in with me still running after him. I grabbed the open door and told him to get out. He started yelling at the confused taxi driver, "Go!" Becca catches up and grabs my arm and tells me again to stop. I turn around, and for the split second it takes to look at her, this guy leans out of the car and throws his drink in Becca's face. Now furious, she starts punching him wildly as I grab the door and jam and kick this guy in the face. The taxi driver peels out and leaves Adam's wife and I standing in the dust. She is soaking wet and very pissed. I gathered up my jacket and put it on when she screamed. I turned around and she said, "It's piss. It's fucking piss." The drink he had thrown in her face that was covering her clothes, face, and dripping from her hair was urine. This guy had given me cheers with that cup, and I watched him drink a mouthful of it. Crazy drunk, piss drinking guy. Let's not meet.
Long-time lurker, first-time poster. This happened back when I was 21 and living downtown with my boyfriend. Had just found out that my boyfriend, who I'd been with for almost 4 years, had been cheating on me. We were invited to a Halloween party that night and had initially declined the invite. But then I found out about the cheating and told him I was going. He could stay at home if he wanted. We were in the process of breaking up and dividing our assets. Anyway, the breakup is relevant to my frame of mind. We lived in a rather sketchy area downtown, one of those brand new apartments built in a slummy area sort of things. And any other night, I'm the type who keeps the windows up, all the doors locked, until out of the area immediately surrounding our apartment. However, my mind was understandably elsewhere, and I had both driver and passenger windows down so I could smoke a cigarette. The first red light I came to on the way to the party was still in the shady part of town. I'm the first car at the light, so I have a full view of the 20-something guy crossing the crosswalk left to right in front of my car. Suddenly, he looks over and makes eye contact with me. I'm flicking ash from my cigarette out the window at this point and may have done a polite head nod. Can't remember. Next thing I know, he picks up his pace, walks over to my passenger window, leans into my car, and asks if he can have a light. When flustered, I tend to be polite, so without really thinking, I hand him my lighter. I was totally prepared to just pull away when the light turned green and let him have it. That's when instead of reaching for the lighter, he reaches into my car and lets himself in. Just sits down like we're old friends. At this point, the light turns green, and I grab my purse and wedge it in between my left leg and the driver's side door. Apparently, I was more concerned with being robbed than the darker alternative. He thanks me for giving him a ride, and I slowly pull away from the stoplight, cars are behind me, and ask him why he got into my car. He replies that he could tell I just wanted to give him a ride, and launches into an obviously fabricated story about needing a ride because his girlfriend had just broken up with him and left him stranded downtown. I tell him I'd take him to the nearest gas station as I needed to get gas. I didn't, but this is the closest place to our location, which was well lit and sure to have people. The gas station was only about 6 blocks away, but was the longest 6 blocks of my life. He tells me I'm pretty and asks me if I can have money so he can get a cab home. Like I'm an idiot. I offer him the $4 in quarters I keep in my car for putting in parking meters. At this point, I think I was just ready to make him stop talking and leave me alone. Instead, he starts throwing the quarters one by one down the cleavage of my shirt. What the fuck? I ask him to stop. He just laughs. Then I see it. The gas station. I pull in and tell him we need to both get out so I can pump. He hesitates and then gets out. I've never locked my car doors so fast in my life. I walk inside, telling him I need to prepay. Instead, I find the first group of people I can. College town and Halloween weekend, so they're out in costumed droves. And explain the situation. At this time, a guy with the group I'm talking with comes to tell his buddies that a guy is out there telling him that I'm his girlfriend, and that I accidentally drove away with my purse on top of my car. No. The group of college kids ended up going outside, making him leave, and then sticking around until I was back in my car and on my way. I have no idea what your intentions were, unwanted hitchhiker downtown, but let's never meet again.